I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker here today, Dr. Supriya Gandhi. Supriya, I'm so happy that you accepted our invitation. I know that you haven't been well, and just to calm everybody's fears, ladies and gentlemen, it was not COVID. She had another problem and she's recovering from that. And I really wish you a speedy recovery and get well soon. So on behalf of the chairman, the trustees, the Director General of the CSMVS, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Museum Society, my own behalf, our members, and our several guests who have joined us here this evening. Thank you, Supriya, for agreeing to give this talk, which personally I've been looking forward to for a very, very long time. I have, since my childhood, been attracted to this figure for I don't know what reason. So when your book came out, I was absolutely thrilled because, you know, he does matter to us even today. I know you're going to talk about it through a historical lens, but I feel very strongly he was an Indian at heart, a Mughal, but an Indian at heart. So indulge me, ladies and gentlemen, while I say a few words about our young, dynamic speaker. It's not easy to get her to give a talk. She has a full load at Yale. And Supriya, I really, really appreciate your agreeing to speak to the Museum Society and members of the CSMVS. As I said earlier, she teaches at Yale University and works on the interface of Islam and Indic traditions in South Asia. She completed her doctorate at Harvard University and has also studied, I was so surprised and happy, in Delhi, Tehran, London, and Damascus, really the cradle of civilization. Before coming to Yale, she taught at the University of Pennsylvania and Haverford College. She is the author of this wonderful book, The Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shukoh in Mughal India, published by Harvard University Press last year in 2020. Her current book project explores the role of the Persian cultural and intellectual ecumene in the making of modern Hinduism. I'm really looking forward to that book, Supriya, and I hope we'll be able to see it in India soon. A little bit about what we're going to hear today. You are having a feast of slides this evening, ladies and gentlemen, beautiful images of that period. And on this talk, she draws on this book that she has written to explore the life and the intellectual project of this Mughal prince, Dara Shukoh, who was born in 1619 and tragically died in 1659. The prince was a Qadiri Sufi who composed numerous works on Sufism as well as Indic religions before being tragically killed in a battle for succession against his brother, the last big Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb. Drawing on an array of texts and images, Supriya examines Dara Shukoh's project in the light of the social and political context of his time, against the idea that Dara Shukoh was a naive mystic, uninterested in rulership. She shows his spiritual explorations and cultural patronage, which were closely linked to his political self-fashioning. Dr. Tariq Mansoor has really summed it up in one of his reviews that Dara Shukoh is a true child of India. I quote him, is an icon for tolerance, harmony, and togetherness. It is due to these values that we Indians, despite many diversities, have been living in unity and oneness for centuries. And a last sentence which really touched a chord. India's neighbors and their regimes can learn from this. So without any more chitter-chatter from me, I have to thank the technical team. We have this evening Yashraj, Aishwarya, Nanalini, so ably led by Jason Johns. Thank you, Jason. He's our honorary secretary, as most of you know. And I hand you over to the tech team. Sit back and enjoy this fascinating lecture, ladies and gentlemen. And Supriya, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Godrej, Dr. Johns, for having me here. I wish I could be in Mumbai in person, but for the moment, this will have to suffice. Just bear with me for a minute while I share my screen. So what I'm going to do today is to sort of rather informally run through Dara Shukoh's life, focusing on some of the important themes from my book. And because you're all friends of Museum Society, and this talk is being hosted by this preeminent museum, I thought that I would focus on discussing Dara Shukoh's life and his intellectual and spiritual project as much as possible through objects. These could be images, Mughal paintings, manuscripts, works of architecture, and other objects that have survived from his time. And indeed, we do still have a very, very rich array of objects and sources from the Mughal court and elsewhere that speak to Dara Shukoh and his context. So this is just the cover of the book on which my talk is based. So just to briefly remind you who Dara Shukoh was. Dara Shukoh was a Mughal prince who was the eldest son of Shah Jahan, the famous Shah Jahan who built the Taj Mahal. And Arjumand Bano, later known as Mumtaz Mahal. So he was actually the second living child. He had an elder sister called Jahanara, who plays a very, very important role in his life and indeed the lives of everyone in the imperial family, really. And then he had three younger brothers, Shuja, Aurangzeb, and Murad. So all of these are important characters in the story of Dara Shukoh's life, and also in the story that really overshadows the way that we look at his life, which is the famous struggle for succession to the Mughal throne, where eventually Aurangzeb vanquishes Dara, which does have this effect of effacing Dara Shukoh and his project for generations to come. So what we're going to do in this talk is to kind of take a look back at the 17th century without really so much the shadow of the outcome of the War of Succession looming over all of this. So what can we actually see from sources that were composed or produced during the 17th century, rather than those that are a products of much later memories? Now, a very common understanding of Dara Shukoh today was that he was a mystic. Yes, he was sort of, in some kind of ivory tower, really into Sufism. That's definitely true. He had an interest in Indic religions, and that sort of disqualified him from real rulership. So there's this idea that Dara Shukoh was some kind of anomaly in the Mughal court. Again, interested in spiritual affairs, but not so successful politically. So that's why we have this opinion, again, a very widely held opinion by R.C. Majumdar. Had his pursuits been less intellectual and aims less spiritual, he might have been more successful in his enterprise. So there's this idea that, perhaps you need some kind of political ruthlessness in order to succeed. So what we're going to do is to look at Dara Shukoh's own conception of his project in the context of a Mughal idiom of kingship. So was he such an anomaly as he seems to be? So I'd like to kind of briefly point out one of the arguments in my book, which is that Dara Shukoh's model of kingship, his idea of the ideal ruler as sort of a philosopher king, was not terribly new. in fact, it drew upon earlier precedents. A famous example of this in the Mughal context is, of course, his great-grandfather Akbar, who is very well known for this. But what is perhaps less well known is that Jahangir too, Dara Shukoh's grandfather, very much engaged in commissioning translations of works on Indic religions, holding dialogues with people of a number of different religions. These have then been recorded by various travelers and so on. And he in turn drew on much earlier Persianate idioms of rulership. So on the left here, we have this famous painting of Dara Shukoh visiting the ascetic Chidrup, also known as Jadrup in the sources. So he goes and he actually walks on foot to meet this ascetic in his very small cave-like dwelling. And as you can see, this is one of the few instances where you have Mughal royals actually seated on the same level as somebody. That's when they're meeting a Sufi or an ascetic, of any kind of religious background. So here he is meeting Chidrup. And you can see that there are some elements in this painting on the left that bear a similarity with the painting on the right. And this is a much earlier painting. It's again part of a kind of genre of illustrations to the epic of Alexander. That is the Macedonian Alexander the Great, who in the Persianate tradition, in Persian literature, for instance, in the portrayals by the famous Persian poet Nizami, he is not only a world conqueror, but he is also the quintessential philosopher king. And he himself, instructs people in sort of philosophical and spiritual matters. And here we have Iskandar, or Alexander, visiting a hermit. And we also have, the horse, the riderless horse, horse kind of symbolizing the carnal soul and so on. And he kind of leaves the Palatine city behind and goes and meets the hermit in the forest. So we have very similar elements in this painting of Jahangir. And I argue, all of these form an idiom of Mughal kingship, which Dara Shukoh borrowed and then reinterpreted in his own way. So let's go to Dara Shukoh's early life. Now, when Dara Shukoh was born, he was the son of a prince. He was the eldest son of a third son. So it was very, very unclear what his life would later, what he would be able to make of his life later on, how his life would unfold. Because Mughal rulers didn't really have a fixed system of primogeniture that, it was fixed, the eldest son would inherit and so on. The way succession worked was that the different princes tried to build up their own networks, and they jostled for the throne, they struggled. It was often a very bloody struggle. In fact, Shah Jahan's own route to the throne was very, very bloody. And he himself, for some years, was in active rebellion against his own father. This is a portrait with actually a little note by Jahangir on the name of the artist over here. And this is like a snapshot from a sort of interlude before Shah Jahan's rebellion, when he was in the good graces of his father. And there are not too many portraits of Mughal children, but there actually are a number from Shah Jahan's own time. Shah Jahan also was very, very fond of Shuja, Dara Shukoh's brother, and he and Nur Jahan, in fact, adopted him and raised him as their own until his death. So here we have this little child playing with, not with toys, but with jewels. And he's seated so closely and intimately, next to his own father, who himself is again portrayed in this sort of very imperial fashion. So it's something that speaks to the very sumptuous ways in which Mughal royals were portrayed, but there's also a great kind of intimacy here between the father and the child. All of that is about to change. So between that portrait and then this portrait made a couple of years after Shah Jahan's accession to the throne, there was a lot of difficulty and bloodshed. Dara Shukoh, along with his siblings, including his brother Aurangzeb, his mother, and his father, really went through this period of ups and downs when his father was in a rebellion against his own father Jahangir, after having eliminated his brother, Shah Jahan's brother Khusro, from succession to the throne. So their fates were very, very uncertain for a great deal of time, until kind of partly serendipitously, partly through sort of ruthless planning and elimination of all competition, Shah Jahan finally acceded to the throne after Jahangir died. So here we have this scene where he is reunited with his sons. Again, he was in rebellion, and for a period, Dara Shukoh and Aurangzeb were actually hostages in in Jahangir's court. So that mustn't have been a very nice kind of experience for them. And here they are with their grandfather, their maternal grandfather Asif Khan, and they bring Shuja also, and they meet their father after his accession to the throne. So this is the point at which Dara Shukoh's own fortunes pivot. And it becomes clear that he is really the favored son. And here he's the favored son of the ruling emperor. So when Dara Shukoh kind of was coming of age in his teens, they say that that a boy at the age of 15 has the ability to discern, right from wrong and so on, and that's really kind of like a transition to adulthood in this period. There are many signs that he saw himself as a ruler in the making. Now, one of the things that that Mughal royals tended to do also was to not only learn, sword fighting and, so kind of other practices of war, but to heighten their connoisseurship as well. So we have from this period, from the period of Dara Shukoh's youth, a really exquisite, almost complete Mughal album that was pieced together by Dara Shukoh. And this is just a folio from it, an image from it. We see, it may not be kind of entirely sort of naturalistic, but we do have this portrait of a young prince with some kind of spiritual teacher. We see an exchange of some discussion regarding books and so on. So this is just kind of indicative of the fact that he had access to his father's painting workshops, calligraphy as well. And he himself wrote a preface to this Murakka or album, where he talks about calligraphy, and the genre of this preface also is to sort of have a little bit of hubris. So he talks about how he's crowned the pen with writing spear and conquered the realm of calligraphy. Again, all of these are practices that were not unique to Dara Shukoh, but we see that with for instance, Jahangir as well. This is just a sample of calligraphy that is attributed to Dara Shukoh. These are some kind of precepts of Aristotle. Again, Aristotle was considered the teacher of Alexander the Great, so there's a resonance with that idea of kingship over here. And then Dara Shukoh turns towards Sufism, and here he's actually introduced to the Qadiri Sufi order by his own father, Shah Jahan. Again, this is a fact that's often ignored. And this is one of the few images. It's an image from a later period in a manuscript of a work that Dara Shukoh himself wrote that depicts Shah Jahan with Dara Shukoh visiting this Sufi Pir, Mia Mir, in Lahore. And there are different accounts of this, because the official accounts say one thing, Dara Shukoh's own narratives say something that's slightly different. And eventually Dara Shukoh, together with the whole imperial family, becomes very close to Mia Mir's successor, Mulla Shah, who was originally from Badakhshan in Central Asia and lives in Kashmir. This is kind of a later portrait of the two, of Mia Mir and Mulla Shah. And above it, you see this this Persian verse, Ham Khuda Mikhai, Ham Dunyai Dun, in Khyalas to Mohalas to Junoon. So this is a verse from Maulana Rumi, the famous Persian poet. And it says, you know, you want God as well, and this base world. You know, this is just mere fancy. It's impossible. It's madness. So, in Dara Shukoh's own narrative, you know, when he went to meet Mia Mir with his father, Mia Mir treated Shah Jahan with the kind of distance that Sufis were meant to treat rulers. And there are many famous stories of this. And in fact, you know, similarly with Jahangir, Mia Mir refused his gifts. And according to Dara Shukoh, he quoted this verse to Shah Jahan when Shah Jahan said, oh, you know, I'm kind of like, I'm weary of this life of rulership, and, you know, I kind of want to like go more towards the spiritual world. And he said, you know, that's, you know, you just ought to be a ruler and do your work as well as you can. But somehow he didn't give that message to Dara Shukoh. So Dara Shukoh presents himself as being the kind of chosen one, the prince whom Sufis actually accept and don't turn away. Again, this is in his own narrative. So we have many rich sources on Dara Shukoh's relationship with the Qadiri Sufi order. But we must keep in mind that this wasn't only his relationship, it was really one of the whole family. And certainly there are narratives that are sometimes in conflict. So Dara Shukoh's first Sufi work was the Safinatul Awliya, which is comprised of biographies of various Sufi saints. And you can see that he wrote that on the 27th of Ramzan in 1640. And then he wrote another work, the Sakinatul Awliya, that emphasizes the superiority of the Qadiri order, especially his own Qadiri lineage, and it also has a bit of his own spiritual autobiography. And then we see Jahanara Begum, his sister, who she also composes a book of Sufi biographies, focusing on the Chishtiya order, which had historically had a strong relationship with the Mughal court. Monisul Arwa, which she also writes on the 27th of Ramzan, 1640. So you can see that the two siblings write their first books on exactly the same day. They finish it on that day, which is considered an auspicious day. It's one of the days associated with the Laylatul Qadr, which has a kind of sacred connotation. And then she also composes her own small short spiritual autobiography, the Risale-e-Sahibiya, that she composes the following year. So piecing these together, we can see that the spiritual trajectory of Dara Shukoh was hugely intertwined with that of his sister, you know, and yet she's often kind of written out of the narrative. And in fact, she speaks about how important her brother was to her, and you know, and how they would exchange books and so on, and really kind of traverse this Sufi path of discipleship in the Qadri order together. And from another work, which is an unofficial work, it's not commissioned by the court, so it doesn't, you know, try to present the court in, you know, in a glorious light or anything like that. This is a figure called Tawakkul Beg, who is a disciple of Mulla Shah, but he also works for Dara Shukoh later on. And after Dara Shukoh's death, he finishes this unofficial chronicle of Mulla Shah's relationship with the imperial family, the Nuskha-e-Ahwal-e-Shahi. So through these, we can kind of see a story where the Sufis of the Qadiri order are trying to distance themselves at first from the imperial family, but they then become closely, sort of much more closely intertwined with them. And in fact, we can see sort of a double process of domestication here, where this kind of rather proud, independent Sufi is eventually folded into the imperial household. And Shah Jahan plays a very important role in this. We don't have too many works with Dara Shukoh's actual handwriting on them that are still extant. But the Khuda Bakhsh library has an autograph copy of the Safinatul Awliya that seems to have Dara Shukoh's own marginal notes and corrections. So that's, the first work that he completed alongside his sisters. And then this is the autograph copy of Jahanara's Monasul Arwa. You can see that they each, have a very distinctive hand, also completed at the same date. So the siblings were definitely working on these books together. And in fact, she does talk about this. They're always traveling, they're always on tour with their father. The Mughal court was not a fixed one, it was a peripatetic court. And they were exchanging books, talking, discussing, trying to meet Sufi notables and so on as they were composing these books. We also have, this is just one example, of just numerous images of Mian Mir and Mulla Shah. And some of them are in Shah Jahani albums. Some of them kind of just are circulating independently. But there's just a plethora of mid-17th century portraits of these two figures. And indeed, we'd get some hints from Jahanara's autobiography that these portraits of their Sufi peers were really used for a kind of spiritual purpose. There is this practice, Sufi practice of tawajjuh, which Dara Shukoh himself writes about, which is kind of real a sort of a mystical communication that takes place when gazing upon the countenance of your spiritual teacher. And Jahanara actually gives a description of using a portrait for this particular purpose. And because of gender norms in those days, she didn't have much direct contact at all with the peer. Her contact was mediated through images, letters, and kind of messengers. And she does talk about using an image, a portrait of Mulla Shah in this manner. This is just one of the extant portraits, the single portraits of Mulla Shah that exist. It was mistakenly labeled a portrait of Maulavi Rum, but it very much is a portrait of Mulla Shah in his slightly earlier years. There are some that show him to be much older. And this is another portrait of Mulla Shah that exists. It's in the British Museum. And in fact, Jahanara has this whole scene where she's really, they've gone to visit Kashmir, and she's had correspondence with Mulla Shah. And there's this point when she beseeches him to actually come so that she can see him, and she's on an elephant, and she's proceeding to leave Kashmir, and he's wearing a crimson shawl, and he sits down under a mulberry tree. And this looks to be like maybe a chinar tree, like a plane tree, but you can see that there's this sort of crimson shawl that is thrown back on this bolster, and he is sitting under a tree. So it may well depict the same episode that she talks about in her autobiography. Now, through all of these Sufi writings, we see that Dara Shukoh moves from merely being the ideal disciple, the chosen one of his spiritual teachers, to actually being this person, this prince, who has received a spiritual gift that no other ruler has before. So he's been specially chosen to combine rulership as well as spiritual advancement, which according to him, hasn't been done to quite that level. So he talks about this hidden voice that he hears in his sleep, that which had not been possible for any emperor on earth, God the Most High has given to you. So this is a trend that we see actually throughout his work and throughout his spiritual evolution, that he does become convinced of his, sort of quite special spiritual powers. And this is something that we see with Akbar as well, where he's initially just, this wonderful devotee of the Chishtis, and until he actually co-opts the authority and the charisma of a Sufi pir into his own persona. So we see this happening with Dara Shukoh before he becomes a ruler, when he's still a prince. And we also see a circulation between the circles of Mulla Shah and Mian Mir. By this point, Mian Mir has passed away, and the royal household. So there are many of actually the imperial servants who join the household of Mulla Shah, and then we have Mulla Shah's disciples joining imperial service. So we see the circulation and the kind of interpenetration of these two households, and this only could have been done with Shah Jahan's knowledge and with his blessings as well. So he was very much involved with that, and there are many accounts of him using Mulla Shah as a kind of confidant also. And then slowly Mulla Shah starts accepting more patronage from the two siblings. So Dara Shukoh, for instance, builds him this Pari Mahal, which according to Tawakkul Beg is this extraordinary heart-enchanting, pleasure-granting place that still exists in ruins in Kashmir. And then Jahanara builds this mosque for him, together with some other buildings in a complex. And Tawakkul Beg reports it as though Mulla Shah actually asks her for this. He's reached this point where he doesn't mind asking the imperial family for patronage. So tell your mistress to make a khanaqah for God. He tells Tawakkul Beg, who then sends this message. And again, this is a mosque that's still extant. And then we have Mulla Shah, who now starts wintering with the imperial family in Lahore, and actually writing praise poetry about them. So, O thou Shah Jahan, and thou Dara, and O Dara, and thou Jahanara, to you the eternal rulership of the world. This is a play on the term Shah Jahani. To you, sovereignty of the world forever. So you can see how Shah Jahan, Dara, and Jahanara are really operating together in building this close relationship with the Qadiri order, and how they reached a point when this own Sufi pir with his own charismatic following is spending time at their place and really kind of becoming part of their household. So I'm going to move now to a new aspect of Dara Shukoh, and that is Dara Shukoh as a soldier and as a military leader. We see this sword over here that's kind of, I think, assumed to be from around 1640. That has a verse, the sword Teg of the prince called Dara Shukoh takes care of 1,000 enemies at one go. And it's held at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it's so this object is a reminder that the prince actually did not shy away from military action. Now, he wasn't really, he didn't have the same military and administrative experience that his brothers did, which proved a disadvantage during the battle for succession. The typical sort of trend was for Mughal princes to go and become governors of a particular province, and then they would get some military experience, because they might kind of engage in some expansion or taming some recalcitrant rebels or so on. And they would get administrative experience. They would build up their own network, and then that would put them in a good position to compete for the throne. But despite this informal system existing, which some scholars have argued actually may have been, it seems like pretty awful, but it may have been like an efficient way of having sort of the strongest survive and succeed to the throne and so on. Mughal emperors often tried to intervene from the beginning. So Jahangir had, different favorites at different points of time. Shah Jahan kept Dara close to him at the court, always, as much as possible. Though Dara Shukoh was quite keen to go on military expeditions. But the one time that he actually did go proved to be a disaster. In 1653, he went on this mission to Kandahar. Now, Shah Jahan, had a lot of very expensive military missions outside the area of Hindustan that didn't prove to be particularly successful. And Kandahar is this city that was kind of being tossed back and forth between the Safavids and the Mughals. It's now in Afghanistan. It was a garrison city, so kind of heavily sort of fortressed, and the Mughal artillery wasn't great. They had to lug heavy cannons all the way there, make cannon shot kind of, on the fly, and then try to penetrate the walls of this garrison. And their artillery wasn't up to it. There were other issues as well. So when Dara Shukoh went, the armies and the generals, the other kind of the Rajas and the others who had brought their own armies along, they had already done the whole thing and came back unsuccessfully under Aurangzeb. So they were pretty exhausted and not really in a position to fight, but he was very enthusiastic about it, and did some kind of preparation and went there. And of course, it didn't succeed, partly just because it was logistically difficult for them to do that, and partly because he didn't have he didn't have adequate experience in sort of managing these different competing interests and personalities. So the Kandahar episode is kind of cited as evidence of his military incapacity, but I think what's obscured is, of course, the fact that Aurangzeb too didn't succeed, and that it really was quite logistically difficult. Despite that, he was keen to go. But after this disastrous episode, he went straight to Lahore, and then that same year, he engaged in dialogues with a Vaishnava ascetic known as Baba Lal. Now we have different versions of these dialogues. Some are very long and elaborate, and they're all in Persian, though he would have had these dialogues in Hindavi. And there are some accounts that there was, somebody who took notes in Hindavi, and then the famous Chandarbhan Brahmin who worked in Dara Shukoh's household then rendered this into Persian. And the dialogues sort of reveal that Dara Shukoh had started reading already works like the Ramayana that already existed in Persian translation, and he was getting increasingly interested in Indic thought. He had already kind of arrived at a certain point, when it comes to Sufi thought, and he was sort of wanting to branch out. And he branched out by interacting with other Sufis and so on. But these dialogues with Baba Lal, this encounter really had left an impression on him. And of course, there's the actual sort of effect of this on his own spiritual and intellectual trajectory, but there's also a way in which this plays into other events that previous Mughal rulers have memorialized. So if you recall Jahangir meeting Jadrup or Chidrup, it's something very similar that takes place now when Dara Shukoh is meeting Baba Lal. This portrait doesn't necessarily depict kind of just that, but we do see a prince kind of resembling Dara Shukoh with a Hindu ascetic and others in a garden. And this then marks a phase of Dara Shukoh's life where he plunges himself quite fully into both political activity and intense sponsorship and study of works on Indic religions. And this is when he is based in his mansion in Shahjahanabad, this kind of new city that is being built. And clearly there's a war of succession that's looming somewhere in the future, because Shah Jahan is now, getting on in years. So this is, just a picture of the so-called Dara Shukoh library, what remains of his mansion still existing in Delhi. So this is, so he is really trying to recuperate from the disastrous Kandahar episode, and is going all out to build relationships with Rajput rulers. So we have princely decrees praising Rana Jai Singh. His own son, Suleiman Shukoh, again weds another Rajput lady. His envoy, he sends his envoy Chandraban Brahman to mediate between Shah Jahan, the emperor, and the recalcitrant Rana Raj Singh, who is kind of, a bit rebellious right now. And then Aurangzeb does the same thing. So both Aurangzeb and Dara Shukoh are independently trying to outcompete the other to forge ties with Rajput rulers. And this is an image from the Badshah Nama that shows Shah Jahan with Dara Shukoh very closely behind him, and they're both being greeted by the legendary kind of prophetic figure Khizr outside Ajmer when they go to quell the rebellious Rana Raj Singh. So you can see that there's really a sort of, both of them, Shah Jahan and Dara Shukoh, are really taking part in these acts of governance together. They're really sort of portrayed almost as co-rulers. Of course, Dara Shukoh is subordinate. He's not the sovereign, but there are many, many ways in which he is ruling alongside his father. And I wanted to kind of just point out again this rather unusual image of Dara Shukoh just sort of wearing a loincloth and seated in a sort of half lotus pose. And I'm not sure as to the period when this was produced. It shows him to be very young. Now, of course, not all the images necessarily need to portray him, at the age he was when the painting was produced. And this, of course, ties into the idea of the mystic Dara Shukoh that we know. But here too, when he's plunging into his immersion in Indic thought, he's definitely keeping tabs on the political situation and also evoking an earlier vocabulary. So here we have an image of Jahangir wearing a loincloth as well, seated with possibly Nur Jahan. And again, holding this wine cup, one of the accoutrements of kingship and so on. They're both seated on a terrace. But there are definitely some resonances, again, between what Dara Shukoh is doing, even in his own intellectual life, and what other Mughal rulers have done. We have very, very prolific intellectual production during this phase. He has earlier written the Risala-e-Haqnuma, where he really, there's some hints in the Risala-e-Haqnuma, which is like a manual of Sufi liberation, where he does use some phrases that may refer to the Trimurti and also to yogic practices. We see a deepening of this interest in his dialogues with Baba Lal in Lahore. And then we really see kind of the fruition of these studies in his famous Majmal Bahrain, or the meeting place of two oceans. And in the Majmal Bahrain, he says that he's produced this work on the basis of his dialogues with the Muwahhidon-e-Hind, the unity affirmers of India. That is, he's referring to really non-Muslims, Hindus, like Baba Lal, and he cites Baba Lal by name, in fact, who have taught him a lot. And what he's trying to show here is that there is a common core of truth, even though vocabularies, whether in Sanskrit or in Persian, are different to describe it. So he sets up a series of equivalences between various Indic ideas and Islamic ideas, based in mysticism. But he doesn't rest after that. He has a dream that kind of leads him to translate the Yoga Vasishtha, a version of that, which was a favorite text among Mughal royals, because there are so many resonances with the idea of kingship over here. The Yoga Vasishtha has the young Ram who's kind of has dispassion about the world. He's not interested in kind of temporal power, and then Vasishtha leads him to living liberation, Jivan Mukti, through telling him this series of interlocking stories. Jahangir was very fond of these stories. Akbar also got that translated, but Dara Shukoh wants to have his own translation. He's not satisfied to kind of just rely on what his ancestors had done. One of the key figures at his court was Kavindracharya Saraswati, who gets a lot of rewards from Shah Jahan and is very, very often at the Mughal court. He's a famous Pandit from Benares, and he's very highly regarded by the other Pandits and so on over there. So he starts becoming an important figure in the court in the 1650s. And then all of this culminates in the Sir-e-Akbar, which is a translation of 50 plus Upanishads by Dara Shukoh in collaboration with these Pandits who come from Benares. This is an image that is probably from that time. It's quite large, for a Mughal painting, and it really seems to have been commissioned by Dara Shukoh. So we have different layers over here, and I would suggest that you look at it from right to left, because in a scenario where the Persian script is written right to left, it sometimes makes sense to look at images also, in that way. And there are three layers over here. I mean, we have sort of the architectural feature, and then the mountains and so on the top band, and then we have some European onlookers, on the left. But then we have this row of prominent Sufis, not of that era, but really some of the canonical figures in Islamic history, including people linked to Dara Shukoh's own Qadiri order. And then in the middle, we see these ecstatic Sufis who are really kind of swooning as they are listening to music and so on. So we have these Sufis in sort of fainting in mystical trances in the middle. But then we have this very unusual feature at the bottom. And so we have a variety of sants and yogis. Some of them who are living unknown to Mughal royals, and others who are not. So we have Chetan Swami, and actually this is one of the ones that isn't labeled. It's probably Chetan Swami, who was the teacher of Baba Lal. And then we have Baba Lal, we have Jadrup or Chidrup, who had met Jahangir, Gorakhnath, Matsyendranath, and then a Shaiva ascetic. And then we have Kabir, the son of Kabir Kamal, Namdev Sena, and so on. So we have these sants and yogis who are kind of arrayed and a little outside the main frame, but not quite in it. And in a sense, this image really illustrates Dara Shukoh's own intellectual journey, because he starts out by writing biographies of the famous Sufi peers and so on, and then he moves out. He's interested in a more kind of ecstatic Sufism, and he collects the ecstatic sayings of various Sufi saints and so on, and then he branches out even further into his dialogues with the Muvahhidon-e-Hind, the Indian unity affirmers, who are displayed so beautifully in this panel over here. The Sir-e-Akbar, I'm just going to say a few words about this before I wrap up my talk. The Sir-e-Akbar is the last work he wrote before his father suddenly fell ill, and then, setting off the chain of events that led to the battle for succession. And this is just an image from an illustrated frontispiece of this, where again you have sort of a ruler, an ascetic, encountering each other. So he composed this along with these Pandits from Benares, as I mentioned. And it wasn't only just a translation of these Upanishads. He framed this work with an argument. He argued that these Upanishads, these ancient celestial works, actually held the key to unlock the secrets of the Quran. And let me just read this quote from this. So it becomes clearly manifest that this verse, the Quranic verse that he's going to quote, is literally applicable to this ancient book. Second, okay. Yes, somehow, yes, this thing is obscuring my own view of my screen, that this indeed is a noble Quran in a book kept hidden, Kitab Maknoon, which none touches save the purified, a revelation from the Lord of the worlds. So this is a verse that has been interpreted in different ways, but Islamic scholars have typically interpreted this to mean that there's an actual Kitab Maknoon, an actual physical book that can to which the Quran refers. But for Dara Shukoh, his argument is, since the Upanishad, which is a concealed secret, part of the meaning of the term Upanishad, is the origin of this book, and the verses of the glorious Quran are found in it literally, and this hidden book is the ancient book through which the unknown has become known, and the incomprehensible comprehensible to this faqir. This faqir is just the way self-deprecating way in which he refers to himself. So the Upanishad itself holds the key to understanding the Quran. And there are many, many other connotations, of course, to this term Sire Akbar. It's also associated with kind of a famous work on the occult that Aristotle, is supposed to have revealed to Alexander, and so on. So there's a very, very long kind of tradition, again, of rulership being linked to really understanding the secrets of the world. But with this, Dara Shukoh has moved to a new phase, because earlier, he credited his teachers, whether it's his Sufi teachers or the Muwahhidin-e-Hind, with giving him this knowledge. But right now, he actually, by translating this work, he has these the keys to this celestial wisdom about the earth. So it's a way of really showing that he has a certain really unprecedented kind of spiritual authority. And remember, at the same time, he was kind of very busy in governance, in keeping tabs on his brothers also, in building ties with Rajput rulers. So both of these combined, I think, are really on the model of sort of what his great-grandfather Akbar did, of really developing his own spiritual persona, as well as maintaining a tight political grip. But except for Dara Shukoh, all of this would unravel very soon. Before I end, I just wanted to show you this illuminated frontispiece of the Sire Akbar from the Asiatic Society in Kolkata. And you can see over here that, it really looks like if you've looked at manuscripts of the Quran, there's some resemblances with that, because the frontispiece is illuminated kind of very beautifully. But it starts with an invocation to Ganesh, kind of written in the Perso-Arabic script on the right. And then on the left is an invocation to Ram. So his Sire Akbar actually has a long life, much after his death, like with other of his writings. Many Hindus who were versed in Persian, the official language, and a very widespread language of the time, used Persian in order to access their own sacred texts. And the Sir-e-Akbar proved a way for those who did not know Sanskrit, or were not in the kind of community of Sanskrit knowers, to access the Upanishads. So that's kind of one of the unexpected trajectories from Dara Shukoh's own life and intellectual project. All of this, of course, comes to an end with the War of Succession. And I'm going to, I think, I can address questions about the War of Succession in the Q&A. I don't need to go into that in detail. I do have a fairly detailed discussion of that in my book. This is an image of a fateful scene in the War of Succession when Dara Shukoh is deceived into alighting from his elephant. And then that leads his men to kind of not see him, and then they run kind of helter-skelter. So it's a fateful point at this crucial battle in Samovar near Agra that sort of clinches his fate, even though he still escapes and struggles for a while thereafter. And of course, this is the point when Aurangzeb also manages to outwit his other brothers, Shuja and Murad, even though initially entering into alliance with them, and then seizes the throne. There are a number of sources regarding the War of Succession. These are just some of the contemporaneous sources. So here, again, we don't have just one official narrative. We really have a multiplicity of narratives that are then later on layered with Aurangzeb's own historiography later on, as well as the accounts of some European visitors. So it's the War of Succession is really one of the most written about incidents in Mughal history. And I can answer more questions about that, but I think I will leave that here and look forward to the discussion.